Morning all, just a quick video. Well, I'm going to try and keep it quick anyway. So I'm going to put in the comments a link to Hugo Talks YouTube video that they've done this morning about France easing up on travel restrictions, because they have been monitoring the situation, obviously, and they have now said that there's 7 countries, and people from these particular 7 countries can go to France, and they don't have to prove why they want to go there. You know, it don't have to be a business trip type thing. You can just go with basically a negative test. No silly jib jab shot, vaccine, not a vaccine needed, which is great. But what I want to say to people, and what I want people to think about, is the reason France have done this is they have been monitoring the health of these 7 countries, and they've said because the health is improving, they are quite happy for the people from these countries to come into their country because the health is improving. One of these countries just happens to be good old Great Britain, England. So ask yourself this: if France is monitoring what's going on in Great Britain or England, and they can see that our health is improving, why are we then not being allowed to travel by our own government and fined £5,000 for attempting to do so? Which it is our inalienable rights to do so anyway. They can't legally stop us. Ask yourself that. If other countries can see that we are healthy enough to travel to their country, why are our own government trying to stop us from travelling? When will you realise it is not about COVID-19? Speaking of which, few pointers about COVID-19. I was going to type all this up because I have got all the documentation. So everything I'm going to tell you is fact. I'm not an anti-vaxxer. Let me make that perfectly clear. I've had lots of vaccines myself. My son's had all his vaccines. I do believe some of them have caused damage, but that's another matter. That's another story. I haven't proved anything, being able to prove that. That's just one of my thoughts. But anyway, I'm a great believer in pro-choice. It's your body, your choice. It's my body, my choice. But I do believe that it should be an informed choice. You should know what's in it and what effect it's going to have on you. And I don't believe anything should be prescribed, injected, whatever, unless it's been properly and thoroughly tested. And this hasn't. I'll come on to that in a bit. So let's start from the beginning, shall we? So when something new is discovered, or potentially new is discovered, it's a process that they're supposed to follow. All scientists around the world have got a process to follow, and it's called Koch's postulate. There's 2. It's Koch's postulate and Rivers postulate, and that's basically the process that they have to follow to identify new viruses, bacteria, things like that. Koch's postulate is the gold standard that they all follow to basically identify a new virus. It's a process of basically extracting a sample, either from the nose, the mouth, a sample of spit, sputum from the lungs, of an infected person. They then put that into a clean petri dish, grow the virus, and they would then put that into a healthy person. If that person then develops the virus with exactly the same symptoms, they would then take samples from that previously healthy person, repeat the process again, so on and so forth. It's a bit more technical than that, but you get my drift. Look it up. Look up Koch's postulate. Look up Rivers postulate. You'll see what I mean. There's a process that they have to follow. The lab at Wuhan did 3 reports, initially stating that they'd followed Koch's postulate, but then at the end clearly stated that they hadn't followed Koch's postulate, because what they did, they took samples from a couple of patients. Well, the first one that they tested had the patient's symptoms were similar to SARS. They got so far with it and put the data into a computer model. Instead of using Koch's postulate, put it into a computer model and made up their own results, basically. So it's never been properly isolated and purified. Because what they do when they put it into the petri dish, they clean all other crap away from it. That's called isolating it. They take away all other crap to make sure that they're only left with that virus, and that is what is then put into the healthy person. So they isolate it by taking everything else away and purifying it by making sure they obviously clean it to make sure there's nothing else there, and that's then what goes into the healthy, either another clean petri dish or a healthy test subject. They've never done that. There's 3 reports being written. I've got copies of at least one of them. Dr. Andrew Kaufman did a video reading those reports, and there's also a report from university in Canada that backs up the 3 reports from the lab in Wuhan, China, that clearly states that. And England and other countries were aware of this. The definition of a pandemic was changed by the World Health Organization to fit what they wanted it to fit. So also, on the 19th of March, our government put a statement on their website stating that COVID-19, and let's just be clear on this, COVID-19 simply means coronavirus ID 2019. So it's a coronavirus. Coronaviruses have been around since, they've been aware of them, I think it's since 60s. They've been around bloody years, hundreds, thousands of years of coronaviruses, but I think it's 60s that they've first identified them. Anyway, so on the government website on the 19th of March, no longer identified as a high consequence infectious disease, and that is based on information gathered, and it has a low mortality rate. Before anybody starts saying, what about all the deaths, blah, 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 you need to compare the deaths around the world and in the UK to all the deaths that we've had for this year and for the previous years, and you'll see that there's hardly any more deaths this year than there has been over the previous years. We have had some extra deaths, yes, but you've also got to take into consideration that we've had an increased number of suicides. There's extra deaths from people with cancer, diabetes, heart disease, etc. that haven't had the treatment. People have not been getting the treatment, and we've had a lot more suicides than we do normally. Anyway, that statement on the 19th of March is still on the government website. It's still relevant. It gets updated regularly. If you go and have a read of that, it explains exactly what a high consequence disease is. And it gives you a list of high consequence diseases, how they spread, and coronavirus is not in that list. So basically, it doesn't spread how they're telling us it spreads. Right. So, my next point. Also, under the Freedom of Information Act, anybody can do this. There's been a number of people done this now. They've written to the Department of Health and Social Care in England, and I know somebody's done it in Ireland as well. They have written and asked the Department of Health to get a sample from a living person and I believe also a deceased person that is supposedly infected with coronavirus, COVID-19, and isolate it and purify it. And they've not done it. They've not been able to do it because they can't find a person that is actually infected with COVID-19. This is all factual information I'm giving you now. So the PCR tests, let's move on to that. So the inventor, the Nobel Prize winning inventor of the PCR tests, Kary Mullis, said to his dying day that they were not to be used as a diagnostic tool. You can't just use one of them and say, oh yeah, it's a positive test. Positive for what? If you've ever had a cold, which the flu and common cold are part of the coronavirus family, so if you've ever had any sort of infection or cold, it's going to test positive because of the amount of times that they're running the cycle. You're only supposed to run it about 15, 20 times. And our government have been running it at 45 cycles. And that's way, way, way too many. So it's going to pick up absolutely all sorts. The one that they're putting up the nose is extremely dangerous because it can break the membrane between the blood-brain barrier. Extremely dangerous. I mean, you think about it, cotton buds, you're told not even to put a cotton bud in your ear, aren't you? A little Q-tip in your ear. Yet they're shoving a big 6-inch stick up your nose, and not just like an adult's nose, up children and babies' noses. Dangerous. Anyway, Boris Johnson and Dominic Raab both stated on live national television that the PCR test carries a 93% false positive rate. That means that out of all the positive tests, only 7% of them are actually positive. So they've not accounted for that when they've been putting the figures out. They have literally just said, oh yeah, it's a positive test, even though they know that 93% of them are false. So if you took the numbers for all the positive tests, all the positive cases, only 7% of those are actually positive. Anyway, as I said, just because it's positive, it doesn't mean anything. Because the only way you can find out what it's actually positive for is by sequencing it. The only person that's actually sequenced any of those tests is Professor Dolores Cahill. She took 1,000 of them with obviously the people's permission, in October and sequenced them, and they all came back either influenza A or influenza B. Which brings me on to another interesting point. The Office of National Statistics, which is where all the figures come from, that's the body that, collects all the figures for everything in this country and, disseminates them. They said in October that they would no longer be recording flu deaths. Everything would be going down as COVID-19, which is fraud. And then if you remember, over the last few weeks, maybe the last couple of months, we've heard that we've wiped out flu because of all this hand washing and mask wearing. No, we haven't wiped out flu. They just haven't been recording it. And if we'd wiped out flu, why on earth were they giving kids the bloody spray vaccination for it up the noses when they went back to school and having the vaccination clinics for it? Pardon me. We haven't wiped it out. They just haven't been recording it. Anyway. Masks. Masks are a complete waste of time. I know some of you are going to be up in arms about this. Think what you want. There's been numerous tests done now that prove they're a complete waste of time. In fact, if anything, they're more harmful. They've actually been proven to cause bacterial infections. There's several other things that they cause, but I'm just not going to go into that now. And to be honest, walking around, you don't even see anybody wearing them properly. Prior to all this, there were several blind studies done on surgeons wearing them in theatre. Masks are only there in theatre to stop splashes and blood and things anyway. And they're actually there to stop the surgeons getting things into wounds as much as anything. But yeah, you need to just go and do a bit of research and look at all this. Because just remember, like I say, 19th March, government put that post on the website, and that was 4 days before they first put us into lockdown. 3 weeks to flatten the curve, remember? Coronaviruses are seasonal viruses. That means they only last for a season. So COVID-19, as I say, it's an ID, coronavirus ID 2019. It was identified at the end of 2019, so it was the winter coronavirus for 2019, early 2020. It would have fizzled out in April 2020. That's when we were flattening the curve. And it did, didn't it? We went into lockdown at the end of March, and the curve flattened in April when we were in lockdown. Why are we still in lockdown? And we'll not be coming out of it on 17th of July. Because the government have put another contract out for advertising till 2023 for all this. If it were a true pandemic, and if this virus were as deadly and as harmful as they say it is, half the planet would be dead. It's a known fact because countless doctors and coroners have come out and actually said now they've been paid to actually record coronavirus as cause of death on death certificates and on people's medical records. They were given incentives. And let's just look at some of these statistics and, the government following the science. SAGE, this group, this scientific group that was set up to advise the government, Do you know what kind of scientists they are? The behavioural psychologists. If you don't believe me, go and have a look, because every single one of them is listed on the government's website. Mathematicians and behavioural psychologists. And go and find the very first document that they drafted. It were all about using guilt tripping everybody into grassing on each other, into using fear tactics to get us to do what they wanted us to do. Nothing to do with a virus. It were all about controlling us. I am being deadly serious. Go look at it. And if we didn't do what they wanted us to do, up the ante. Anyway, Neil Ferguson, remember him? You want to have a look at his track record? He's the one that said 500,000 people were going to die. His track record's fantastic. But Professor Yeadon spoke to him. Professor Yeadon, Mike Yeadon, he's brilliant. He used to be he was CEO for Pfizer for 30 years, so he knows what he's talking about. When he spoke to Neil Ferguson, do you know what he said? I don't understand where all missing dead bodies are. Not, I'm really glad that these people didn't die. I don't understand where the missing dead bodies are. And then the last little bit, Patrick Vallance, on 21st of September, he were predicting that come middle of October, we'd have, what were it? 50,000 cases a day. Beggars belief, doesn't it? You really need to go and do some research. Most of the information you need is actually on the government website. It's right there in black and white in front of your face. I mean, let me just read this to you about the vaccine, not a vaccine. Because it's not a vaccine by the very definition of a vaccine. And you think it's safe to go get it. Like I say, I'm not anti-vax. It's all about free choice. I'm all about pro-choice. This, I got this via the government website. There's a link that takes you to it. It's Vaccine Knowledge Project. How vaccines are tested, licensed and monitored. It can take many years for a vaccine to pass through all that. Just bear with me. Hang on. I'll start again. It can take many years for a vaccine to pass through all the stages described below. In the case of the Men-B vaccine, for example, it took 15 years from the first idea to the vaccine being licensed for use. These are some of the stages a vaccine will have gone through before use. Reviewing what has been done before. Theoretical development or innovation, coming up with a new idea or a variation on an existing idea. Laboratory testing and development. This involves in vitro testing using... Just bear with me. Pippin, just a minute. Using individual cells and an in vitro, in vitro testing, often using mice. The vaccine, listen to this bit, the vaccine has to pass rigorous safety tests at this stage and demonstrate that it works in animals. Well, these vaccine, not vaccines, have never, ever in 20 years of trying to get an mRNA passed have all failed. Every single one of them has failed at the animal phase. So they have completely skipped that phase this time and gone straight to human testing. And you think that's okay? And shall I tell you why they've all failed? Because all the animals died. You can go look it up. It's common knowledge. Anyway, I'll leave it there. Everything I've told you is fact. I've got paperwork to prove it. A lot of it's come from the government's website. Just bear with me. It's come from British Medical Journal, peer-reviewed medical reports. If there's anything you want to know, just ask. But I ain't got it off Karen on Facebook. I can promise you that. Okay, guys. But just think, is any of what's going on really making sense? Really? Take care.